kings of Judah that take place. So today we're going to be looking at moving forward on Judah's timeline. But the key thing that we looked at last time is in 722, Assyria was the dominant superpower in the north, and they came down and they conquered Israel and took them off as captives. And really, we always, when you read the Bible, because it's being told by Jewish people within Israel, that's their perspective on things, we miss out that really Israel is just a small player on the field during that time. The real battles are between Egypt, the dominant power in the south, and these other powers, the Hittites earlier, then the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then later on the Medes and Persians are going to be coming. And so it's really a contest between the north and the south, these superpowers. Israel just finds itself caught in the crosshairs, so to speak. So moving forward, Hosea, and Israel going off into captivity in Assyria during that time, and I think it was Marty was saying I need to tell people where these places are modern day. The capital of Assyria was Nineveh, modern day Mosul, and really where Assyria gets its name, it's from the city Ashur, which is in between Nineveh and Babylon, or in between Mosul and Baghdad. So if you were to put your fingers on the map today and kind of look at it, you'd see. And we called them Assyrians because they came from Ashur. And even the names that they're going to take, for example, today we'll look at Ashurbanipal, this great king of Assyria. He takes his name, Ashur, from the actual city. And he is the father or the leader of the people of Assyria. And that's the name that he's given, what his name Ashurbanipal means. But in Judah, in the south, where we're looking at this week, we get Hezekiah, who's a good king, Manasseh, and then Josiah, who of the kings of Israel, after David and Solomon, he's the third greatest king. He's really quite a phenomenal guy. And then right up here around 600 BC, we're going to get Israel is going to really run into sort of its last days, and you'll get Jehoiakim, you'll get Zedekiah. You actually have a couple other little half-brothers in there that get put in or out, and I'll explain how they fall in and out of the timeline during this period. But we're going to bring you up to around 600 BC when Judah is going to go off into captivity also. So the two big dates that you need to realize for these captivities are 722, when Israel goes off, and then around 600 BC, when Judah is going off. And why we can say Israel 722 is we have a definitive date when Israel was destroyed, wiped out, and everybody taken off into captivity. With Judah, what's going to happen is you're going to have a succession of attacks. It's not going to be one captivity. It's going to actually be waves of captivity that take place during a period of time. And the reason for this is that the major power at the north at that time is Babylon. They're waging war against Egypt. And it's one of these where you have battle after battle after battle after battle until finally you have this decisive victory. So, the books that are written during this time, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they actually get written later, but they're covering this period of time. That's why I have them down there in kind of a different color. Isaiah kind of falls at the beginning of this time frame. So when you read the book of Isaiah and Isaiah's prophecies, he's covering the period of the fall of Israel and the beginning of just Judah being left. And then Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, they really focus on this very end of Judah's time in Israel. Very, very difficult times, and especially Jeremiah. This is one of these guys that just loves to get in the king's face. And he's either giving them good news or bad news, but he's always right there in the king's face during this time. So, bringing us up to speed on what's taking place, I was saying how Israel's a small player in the field here and what takes place. First off, before I kind of show the expansion of the Assyrian Empire, the thing I want you to notice here is on the map, see all the little red lines? They're sort of the ancient highways that we know from this time period. And the thing I want you to realize, you don't have to pick them all out, but the thing I want you to realize when you look at these red lines on the map, where do most of them fall? They go right through Israel. So if Assyria or Babylon are going to wage war against Egypt, or Egypt is going to wage war against Assyria or Babylon, guess who they're going to be marching through? They're going right through Israel. And so seeing just the geography and where the highways went really helps you understand kind of, the dice are kind of loaded against Israel during this period of time. The Assyrian Empire that we looked at last week expanded from sort of a regional empire up in what we would call modern-day Syria and Iraq to basically controlling Iran, Iraq, much of Lebanon and Syria today, parts of Turkey, and even much of modern-day Egypt. So the Assyrian Empire really expanded greatly around 700 BC, the time when Israel got taken off into captivity. Now what happens, starting around 700 BC, is we start getting a number of revolts within Assyria, and then we start getting a number of attacks from outside of Syria. Because what happens is you end up with a series of about 3 or 4 emperors in Assyria who aren't very politically adept. And they're trying to control and pull back together Tiglath-Pileser, the fifth. We looked at 2 of them last week. Remember the second one. After his great expansion, you don't have people that are as gifted as him. And so you start running into revolts within the empire and attacks from outside. And one of the first attacks that takes place here, as I said, I'm jumping ahead of myself, and I've got to keep track of things. And I'm also breaking my little stir stick. And before I swallow that while I'm trying to speak, which would be a really ugly scene. One of the first things is Egypt rebels against Assyria. And when Egypt rebels against Assyria, it convinced Israel and some of these other little small nations over there that Assyria had conquered under Tiglath-Pileser. They convinced them to rebel also. And so Assyria then comes down and sacks Egypt. And in the process of doing that, they also, as they came through what used to be Israel, and then when they came through Judah, and when they went down into Egypt, they carried out a systematic campaign of destroying any fortified cities. So any cities that had city walls, they destroyed them, because they realized that if Egypt decides to mount a rebellion again, it needs fortified cities to garrison its troops in order to move against you. It's not like today where you have aircraft carriers or Air Force. Well, an Air Force base is a great example. You got to build the things and man them and station them. They're not incredibly portable like maybe a tank brigade would be. They're very long-standing type investments. And so look at these fortified cities maybe as an Air Force base. Is that a good comparison? I got 2. That's awful. Okay. Okay, so. Yes, okay, thank you. So they destroyed all these cities and fortified garrisons. And this really creates then a lot of problems for the people that live there. Because if you don't have fortified walls upon your city, not only does it make you vulnerable to foreign attackers, but it makes you vulnerable to looters and bandits and all. It really destabilizes the region there. So Assyria's conquest down there had a great benefit for the people of Assyria, but it created a lot of instability within the ancient Middle East down there. And this is a picture from Ashurbanipal. So around 670, Ashurbanipal comes to power. He's the guy that I was telling you. He takes the name Ashur from the city Ashur, which the Assyrians are from. And then Banipal, meaning the father or the leader of the Assyrians. And he comes to power, and he is a brilliant leader. And not only is he a good political and military leader, but he's also sort of one of these Renaissance men. He learns foreign languages, he studies stuff, he's absolutely a brilliant leader. And so one of the unfortunate things is that with ISIS's raids on Mosul and Kirkuk and some of these places, you had these phenomenal statues of Ashurbanipal that go down back to this period of time, and his libraries and stuff like this that they destroyed. 2,900-year-old resources, and they just went in and destroyed these things. But this is one in the British Museum of, it's an example of Ashurbanipal's reign, because in this one, the city of Susa, which was up in Lebanon, resisted his expansion, rebuilding the Assyrian Empire. And here's off kind of a carving on a wall, and it shows his soldiers at the top systematically dismantling the walls of the city, and then down below, them carrying off people as slaves and looting the process. And then this is exactly what we saw in the story today when Eric read from 2 Kings 36, that when the Babylonians came against Jerusalem, what did they do? They tore down the walls, they burned the city, and they looted it. And so what the Bible describes is actually what we know from all these different documents during this time. The key thing under Ashurbanipal, from about 670 to 630, the Assyrian Empire rises up again. So 700, it kind of goes into a state of decay, revolt, rebellion, outside attacks. Then about 30 years later, 670, it rises up again. But the problem is, Ashurbanipal, with his expansion, really created a lot of hardship and resentment on everybody else around him. And so as a result, starting around 630 BC, you get, once again, his son that takes the throne isn't as good as he is, and you run into problems. And the big problem that he has, that he faces, is from Babylon, one of these countries that he controlled, that Ashurbanipal controlled. But once he dies and his son takes control, Babylon is now on the rise. First thing Babylon does, we don't have it on the map here, is they go over and they conquer modern-day Iran. Then they turn their sights back to the people that used to rule them, the Assyrians. And they come up and they start attacking the Assyrians. And how much time we got here? This is kind of free. Don's not paying me to tell you about this. So I'll just throw this in because I'm doing okay time-wise. But under Ashurbanipal, we always talk about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. One of the things is a lot of scholars really think is that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon weren't in Babylon. They were actually in Nineveh. And once Babylon captures Nineveh, then it becomes part of the Babylonian Empire. So these Greeks and other historians would then talk about these Gardens of Babylon, because it's in the Babylonian Empire, but they were really in Nineveh. And the reason why this is kind of interesting is to give you the scale of these empires we're talking about. When Ashurbanipal is emperor of the Assyrian Empire, he goes on this huge building campaign. He actually forms canals along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to kind of allow navigation and better travel. And these canals were like 200-300 feet wide, 50 feet deep. I mean, they were huge undertakings. Nineveh, which is an incredibly dry area, he actually built canals from the mountains in the north of Iraq, up in the modern Kurdish areas today. These canals stretched for 150 to 200 miles. They were 60 to 70 feet wide, 30 feet deep, brick-lined and plastered the whole way. They had aqueducts over valleys and things like this. I mean, the scale of his building and his empires were absolutely phenomenal. So when you compare what is taking place in Nineveh and Babylon to what Jerusalem is playing with, immediately you realize that when God starts telling the kings and people what to do and what not to do, there's a lot more that's going on here, and they should really listen to what these prophets are saying. So, Ashurbanipal dies. First nation to rise up against them are the Babylonians. And the Babylonians are incredibly successful at doing this. As I said, they took Iran, they start going up, and they start taking much of the Assyrian Empire. Now, this brings us up to where we're getting to in our story very, very closely. And that is in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. We need to back up a little bit. We have Josiah in Judah. Actually, I should be Judah under Josiah, not Israel. Israel's gone. So, excuse me for that. But when he becomes king, notice he becomes king shortly after Ashurbanipal dies. And now the Assyrians are weak again. They're falling down. Josiah becomes king. But the thing about Josiah is he's a really good king. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, it says, Josiah became was 8 years old when he became king. Now the problem here is it says when he was 8 years old. There's a huge textual problem with the number there. We're not sure if that's 8, 18, 28, 38. We're not sure of the number, but probably most people think probably 28. The numbering for this king's age is one of these things that is a little tricky here. And it has to do with how they were counting numbers, because they didn't have numbers like we do, where we use the Indian script to do it. Him and his wife aren't here. Anyways, the numbers that we use, 1, 2, 3, that we write with, we always call them Latin numbers. The Latins took them from the Arabs. The Arabs took them from the Indians. And so it backs up to 700 BC, but that's another thing John's not paying me to talk about here, but we'll throw it in for free. But the key thing here is how they wrote down these numbers in ancient Hebrew was problematic, and then how the scribes copied them later on. They would look at it and they go, that doesn't seem right. Maybe it should be this or that. And so you just run into problems. But the key thing is, for this guy to rule as wisely as he does as king of Israel, king of Judah, he's probably not 8 years old, definitely, okay? He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what was right, what the Lord approved, and he followed in his ancestor David's footprints. Now, as we look at what this guy does and the text about him, the key thing here from the author, the Chronicles point of view, and remember, Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, is written from sort of someone who's interested in the political history of Judah. Chronicles is more told from an author or authors that are more interested in the religious history. So he's interested. He does what's right in God's eyes. Down in verse 33, Josiah removed all the detestable idols from the areas belonging to Israel and encouraged all who were in Israel to worship the Lord their God. Throughout the rest of his reign, they did not turn aside from following the Lord God of their ancestors. So Josiah, according to Chronicles, he's very interested in the religious reforms. But we know from the prophets, we know from 2 Kings, that he also does a lot politically. So he's able to take Judah, this small little vassal state of the Assyrians, and when the Assyrian Empire runs into trouble, he's able to expand Israel back up to about the size of what King David had. So he's doing religious reforms, he's doing political reforms, he's doing economic reforms. Things are great under him. And one of the simple reasons for it is, while the cat's away, the mice will play. In other words, Assyria is not on the map right now. They're dealing with the Babylonians, and they're not doing it very well. And so Israel is able to expand. And the other thing is, Egypt really sees this as a good thing. Because as long as we have a fairly strong Israel to our north, that's going to give a nice little buffer zone between us and the Babylonians or the Assyrians. In other words, this whole idea of having Israel there and strengthening it and fortifying its cities is great, because then if Assyria decides to attack Egypt again, they have to plow their way through Israel first. That means by the time they get to us, they're tired, they're worn out, and they've lost a lot of men. So this is a great thing from Egypt's point of view. And if you read the text, you see that Israel and Egypt, Judah and Egypt are getting along fairly well during this period of time. Now, after Josiah had done all this for the temple, King Necho of Egypt marched up to do battle at Carchemish. And I'll show you where Carchemish and these places are here in a second. But the king of Egypt is battling up to do battle at Carchemish on the Euphrates River. Josiah marched out to oppose him. And you go, why, if these guys are getting out, is Josiah going out to do battle? And the other thing, I showed you the highways. We know why Necho is going to go through Israel. If he's going to go up and do battle with Assyria or Babylon, he has to go through Israel. So Josiah goes out to do battle with them. Necho sent messengers to him, why are you opposing me, O king of Judah? In other words, hey, we're on the same side here. What are you doing? I'm not attacking you today, but the kingdom with which I am at war. God told me to hurry. Stop opposing God who is with me, or else he will destroy you. Now what's interesting here is the author of Chronicles, when he talks about Necho saying, God is with me, God has told me to do this, he doesn't correct it at all. It's almost as if in the word from the author of Chronicles' point of view, that God actually spoke to Necho, that God actually told Necho to do this, and this is going to be Josiah's big mistake, and this is actually going to set up the failure of Judah, its downfall. We're going to look at this. Stop opposing God who is with me, or else he will destroy you. But Josiah did not turn back from him. He disguised himself for battle. He did not take seriously the words of Necho, which he had received from God. He went out to fight him in the plains of Megiddo. Archers shot King Josiah. The king ordered his servants, take me out of this chariot, for I am seriously wounded. And he's actually going to die as a result of this battle. So, what is taking place here? The Babylonians are pushing further and further into Assyria. The Assyrians have retreated over into like modern day Lebanon and Syria, a lot where ISIS controls the region now. They've retreated over that direction. They're headed that way. Assyria is launching a series of counterattacks. And then we have this story about King Necho in the pink here, going up. He's going to go up and do battle. But here's the interesting thing is, he's going up to do battle with the Assyrians against the Babylonians. And the reason why he's doing this is he realizes that Assyria is weak, Babylon's on the ascendancy, and if we want to have some playing room down here to the south, it's to our advantage to weaken Babylon. Assyria is not a threat now, but Babylon will be. Now, from Israel's point of view under Josiah, he doesn't give a rip about Babylon. He's never done battle with them. They're not a concern for him on the political playing field, but he knows about Assyria. And so this is why, from a military and political point of view, Josiah went out, and right here, the little yellow arrow where he goes out to do battle at Megiddo. And then this is where the prophets, when they talk about the great battle at the end of time, they look at this battle at Megiddo as the defining trait or the example of this. In other words, where did Israel suffer its worst cataclysmic defeat? It was by Megiddo. And this is where we get our Megiddo, or Armageddon. So they take it from this battle, and then they say in the future there's going to be another Armageddon type battle. And so they push it there. Josiah is going to die. Israel is going to suffer a horrible defeat under the Egyptians there. The Egyptians will then push up, and with the Assyrians they're going to have this battle up here in Carchemish, and it's going to be a bloodbath on all sides around. Egypt's going to get slaughtered. Assyrians are going to get slaughtered. Babylonians are going to get slaughtered. There is no real clear victor here. But if you read the Assyrian tablets, they think they won. If you read the Babylonian tablets, they think they won. And if you read the Necho's tablets in Egypt, he thinks he won. But really what they did is they just kind of stopped everything in the playing field where they were at that time. The result is that Josiah dies, and so Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king. The king of Egypt prevented him from ruling in Jerusalem. In other words, he serves for like 1 month. The reason is Necho goes up, does battle, and then on his way back down he says, you know, Josiah tried to stop me. He just cost me a lot because we got up there about a month later. He just cost that battle a lot. And his son Jehoahaz is now king. Well, I'm not having any of this. We just conquered you guys. You are now an Egyptian puppet state. And so he made Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim king of Judah and Jerusalem. And Necho seized his brother Jehoahaz and takes him off into Egypt. So because of Josiah's not listening to what the king of Egypt said, or from the point of Chronicles' point, not listening to what God said at this one particular point, Judah is destroyed. The great kingdom that Josiah had built up is gone. They're now a puppet state of Egypt. And even the king who was supposed to be in the place, he takes one brother off, and then he puts another brother in power who he thinks is going to be more favorable to Egypt. So this sets the stage then for what's taking place. After this great battle of Nebuchadnezzar, we go a few years. We're coming down about 25 years later. And if you had Ashurbanipal in Assyria, who was a great king, the Babylonians now get their version of him, this guy Nebuchadnezzar. And he is phenomenal. He's a great strategician. And if Ashurbanipal was a great strategician and was able to expose things, his weakness is he was incredibly bloodthirsty. Nebuchadnezzar takes a very different view when he conquers people. And so first thing he does is he goes up and does battle with Assyria again at Carchemish, defeats them there. And then after Carchemish, he goes south. And he heads south to do battle with Egypt. Now I'm going to bring Jeremiah in here for a moment here, because I was telling you that he's one of the prophets who speaks and he's always in the king's face. Jeremiah comes up and he's talking about all the different nations, and he spoke about Egypt and the army of Necho, king of Egypt, which had camped along the Euphrates River at Carchemish. So talking about that previous battle up there. Now this was the army that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, who was ruling over Judah. So what he's telling you here, what the author of Jeremiah is telling you here is, Babylon goes up, defeats the Egyptians and the Assyrians up there at Carchemish. They head south, and we've got this puppet king, Jehoiakim, in Jerusalem. And so this guy's only reigned 4 years. His brother reigned like a month before Necho got rid of him. Now he's been reigning for about 4 years, so you see you're getting, bang, 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 quick succession of leaders. But he's heading south to do battle. And then we go to 2 Kings to fill out a little bit more. The king of Egypt did not march out from his land again, for the king of Babylon conquered all the territory that the king of Egypt formerly controlled between the brook of Egypt and the Euphrates River. So see the big red line coming down? That all was formerly Egyptian territory. So when Necho went up to do the battle of Carchemish, he took all that. Now the Babylonians are on their way down, and they take all those puppet states away from Egypt. But Kings lets us know that once he's fought his way all the way down there, he's not able to push into the Nile River Delta. In other words, his troops are worn out, they're fatigued, he needs to rebuild the army, he's reached that far. But what it means is that Judah is now under Babylonian control. So they've gone from an independent state under Josiah, rebuilt and expanded. Josiah makes this mistake resisting Necho. Then you get his son. That guy's in power for about a month before Necho replaces him with another. He's in power for about 4 years before the Babylonians come and replace him with another. And so now Israel, or Judah, is under Babylonian control. This brings us to the next king of Israel, or Judah. next king of Judah is Zedekiah. Because when they come down and they conquer, the Babylonians look at this and they say, well, you had Josiah, independent king. Then you had Joahaz, reigned for 1 month. Then you had Jehoiakim that Egypt put in place. We don't like any of those. We're going with the third option, and they put another son in place, Zedekiah, as his king. And so Zedekiah is now king. He's 21 years old. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not humble himself before the prophet Jeremiah. Oh, this is kind of interesting. The king humbled himself before this guy Jeremiah, who's always in their face. The Lord's spokesman. But also, he rebelled against the king Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, Zedekiah is put in power by the king of Babylon. And he wants him to be a puppet state, and he's going to be the buffer zone between Babylon and Egypt. In other words, if Necho put him in power, so that if the Babylonians come towards us, they have to go through Israel to get to Egypt. Now Babylon does the same thing. They put him in power, so if the Egyptians ever come to us, they have to come through Judah, and it'll slow down their advance. The problem is, Zedekiah, the person they put in power there, A, is rebellious against God. He's rebellious against Jeremiah, but this streak, it just doesn't end there. Like most rebellious people, it's not like they're rebellious against one thing. They just reject everything, and so he rebels against the Babylonians. Bad decision. 2 Chronicles picks up and it says, the Lord continually warned them through his messengers, for he felt compassion on his people and his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers. They despised his warnings and ridiculed his prophets. So this is why I brought in Jeremiah and 2 Kings, to let you see that what it's talking about here is something that all these other books talk about as well. It's not just Chronicles giving their perspective. This is a very comprehensive picture here that's taking place. Finally, the Lord got very angry at his people, and there was no one who could prevent his judgment. Just like Elijah on Mount Carmel, when all the prophets are crying out, and it says, no one heard, no one listened, no one answered. The same thing here. They've gone off their own way, and probably when it says no one could prevent his judgment, it's probably talking about they're calling on Baal and Asher and all these different deities and gods in Israel that Zedekiah reinstituted the worship of. No one is able to answer or prevent God's judgment. And then we come to 2 Chronicles 36, which we read this morning. So God brings up against them the king of Babylon, who slaughtered them, their young men. He did not spare the young men or the women or even the old. God handed everyone over to him, and he carried away to Babylon all the items in God's temple. They burned down the Lord's temple. They tore down the walls of Jerusalem. They deported to Babylon all who escaped the sword. And this is why I showed you the picture of the relief of Susa. So you get an idea of this is, they came in with like a army, but also like a deconstruction. Instead of doing construction or nation building, they did nation destruction, just tore everything down. And the result is that Judah is now carried off over into the region of modern-day Babylon in their captivity. And we have this psalm that's written during this time that Eric read. By the waters of Babylon we laid down and wept. We sat down and wept. We remembered Zion. On the pillars in her midst we hang our harps. On the poplars in her midst we hang our harps. For there our captors ask us to compose songs. Those who mock us demand that we sing and be happy, saying, sing for us a song about Zion. How can we sing a song to the Lord in a foreign land? And Catherine and I were talking, the thing that we always kind of like the beginning of this psalm. The end of it we don't like too much, where they say, blessed are those who take your babies and dash them upon the rocks. I mean, just brutal. I mean, this is not turn the other cheek or love your neighbor and pray for those who hate you type New Testament theology. This is, we just hope another army comes in and just grabs your babies by the heel and goes around smashing them on rocks. I mean, it's just brutal what they see here. But they get taken off into this foreign land in captivity. Now, I was saying that the Babylonians had a different process. When the Assyrians took people off, if you were a slave under the Assyrian Empire, you were basically judged on what you could get on the meat market. They just sold you for what you were worth, labor-wise, or whatever attributes your body possessed. That's where you went off. When the Assyrians took people off, they tended to take them off and put them in communities. So you would have maybe 100 Jews settled in this town and 100 over in that town or something like that. So they allowed the people to keep their identity as a people, as a religion, or something like that. You are now our slaves. You are now subject to our policies as a nation. But, well, slavery and deportation like that is never human, but it's much more humane than under the Assyrians. And as a result, it created a sort of a stronger Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was much more multicultural in this respect than the Assyrians. In fact, even Alexander the Great, when he invades and he takes over the region of what used to be the Babylonian Empire, it's really the Persians during that time, and he sees the way they incorporate other cultures into their cities. Alexander the Great does the same thing. He marries a Babylonian woman. Anybody know the great song by Sting? Roxanne, you don't have to, It goes back to this because Roxanne was a Babylonian princess who he married. And then the Persians then accused her of being a prostitute for him. And so even down to this day, this story continues. But he brought in Persian generals, he brought in Persian soldiers, and made his army kind of one of these very interesting fighting forces in the ancient Near East. It wasn't a monocultural type thing. But this brings us what we were looking at here. The Jews end up over in the Babylonian region, and they're going to be there for 70 years. And really, I think the whole point of this story is when you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it's being told from people within Israel, and it's also being told, if you read Chronicles, it's being told from a person who has a very religious or a temple orientation. So when he tells the story, it's always, they did this in regards to God, rebellion against God, and things like this, which is incredibly important. I was trying to think of a great example recently, and it totally skipped my mind. But if you're inside a community or inside a group and something happens, you're going to tell the story from that perspective. But if you're on the outside and you're looking at it from the outside, you're going to get a totally different perspective. It's kind of like the whole, current administration and the press. Every presidential administration has had a rough relationship with the press. And the reason is the executive branch is trying to do one thing, and the press is trying to figure out what's going on. And the way the press, who's outside the administration, sees things versus those inside the administration are going to be very, very different. And so every presidential administration always thought the press got it wrong, and the press always thought the administration was against them. And that's a great example. With the book of Chronicles, you have people within Israel telling the story of Israel and what's taking place. Obedience to God, national dedication, worship of the temple. These are the important lessons and stories from their perspective. But the other thing I think that looking at the bigger picture of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt helps us to see is that this little nation state, Israel and then Israel and Judah, their whole success or failure depended upon their obedience to God. In other words, there was nothing in that nation that made them a great nation or a great empire. It's not like you read about the great empires of Israel and you compare it to like the pyramids or Luxor or the Parthenon or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They didn't have any of those resources. So really it was their obedience with God that allowed them to navigate these much larger geopolitical forces that were taking place there. And when they disobeyed it is when they got into trouble, like Josiah. It's interesting that the author of Chronicles puts the words of God in Necho, the king of Egypt. God told me to do this. Why are you resisting God? If you resist God, he will destroy you. And it's like Necho is a prophet. But then when you come down with Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, and then Zedekiah, these are three. Well, Jehoaz, you don't learn. I mean, the guy's in power for like, a month or two. But Jehoiakim does evil. Zedekiah is like the worst of the worst. He just doesn't listen to anybody, inside, outside, anywhere. And as a result, Israel gets destroyed. Now we'll pick up next week with the restoration and looking at what takes place during this period of time. One of the things I will tell you is that during the Babylonian captivity, the 70 years off that they're in captivity, the religion of Israel is going to completely change during that period of time. How it changes, we'll talk about next week. But it's actually a good way that it changes. So I will leave you there, and if you have any questions or you want to talk a little bit more about this, I'll be over getting more coffee.